Yes, we already have some questions. It's going to be hard. We'll take the first four, and then we have enough time. So I believe Eric was the first one, and then Omer, and then Mark, and then we'll. Okay. Yeah,
I know we want coffee, so I'll be quick. The talk was so good, so nuanced, and the comments so great. I'm just going to focus on a kind of methodological point about agency, a scholarly kind of methodology here. Because you use the term at times, Paul, in our own time, a variety of far-right subcultures have revived and refashioned. You talk about ideological moment, as if the actors here are drawing on a palette that they're making conscious choices about what to use or abuse from the past and the present. But I'm thinking, what about the geopolitical moment, right? I mean, the reason anti-Semitism isn't as central is not that these people don't want to be or couldn't be anti-Semitic. It's unfortunately the geopolitics. The Holocaust and the foundation of Israel solved the Jewish question. I mean, it's a tragedy, but it solved it for Central and Eastern Europe. And then the Soviet Union helped out, and the communist parties, as you point out in your book, by kicking everyone else out. So there's no Jews there, not that racism and anti-Semitism are directly linked to reality, for them to be at the center of the problem, of however we want to call it. In the meantime, as Atina and Manuela have pointed out, there's a new clear geopolitical moment, and it involves Islam, and it involves refugees, and it involves Israel, which is now a proxy colonial state, as one historian puts it, that seems European, right? And you no longer have to deal with the Jews in Europe. That can be a proxy for European far-right views. So are they really fabricating things and refashioning? Is this really an ideological issue, or is it about geopolitics, right? That's changed. So that's my question.
Thank you.
So I have a question to each. Paul, quickly, could you think, thank you for the talk, it was great. Could you think of what anti-Semitism would have looked like, say, in Hungary and Italy, had the Nazis not come to power? To Consuela. Manuela.
Consuela, the Americans told me, because there is a maid that is called Consuela. And I'm a maid, but they are called Consuela. You're not the only one.
So you said that the 19th century is the beginning of this kind of new anti-Semitism. It's of course also the century of Jewish emancipation. And so can you think through the relationship between the two? That is that a large part of the motivation for a new kind of anti-Semitism is emancipation, since the Jews are actually coming into European societies. And within that, part of that is the Jews become part of a colonizing project, the European colonizing project. A very former student of mine, Christian Davis, wrote about the Jews who were part of the German colonizing project. And that was part of them becoming German by colonizing Africa. And of course, it's the beginning, the latter part is the beginning of Jewish colonization of Palestine. And so how does that play into that? And to Atina, so my question is this, I mean, or it's actually not only to you, but to the entire panel. We know, I think, that anti-Semitism has been used, certainly the last year, as a tool to shut down speech. What does that mean? What do we do with the fact, not only that it's used to shut down speech, certainly in the United States, but also in Europe, but also that it may be a tool that will bring back anti-Semitism, not the fake anti-Semitism that is being used as, but real anti-Semitism that comes from the other side of the political spectrum. Thank you.
Please, Mark.
This is partly a sort of question for Paul, but it's partly also a volleyball which I want to throw towards Aristotle to put over the net, because Aristotle has written, which will be coming out this summer, a quite superb essay on fascism and the Holocaust for the Cambridge History, and so in part I'm sort of passing the ball over there. But it occurred to me, Paul, in this super paper that fascism, actually your answer to Tim Mason one, but yes, I'm not going to talk that much about fascism either, because fascism appears as a place in which anti-Semitism articulated, but in a way, looking at the explosion after the First World War and the power of Judeo-Bolshevism and the violence in the early period, and then later the role of Nazism as disseminating and transforming the weight of anti-Semitism in the Italian case, fascism itself doesn't appear that much of an agent. So I just want to kind of prod you a bit to reflect on, and then also then I want to give Aristotle the opportunity also to jump in, but to prod you a bit on what you think you might say about specifically the where fascism might work in a discussion about this.
So thank you again for these talks. My question is for Paul. So often we talk about the historical links between anti-Semitism and racism in terms of death rather than birth. So I really appreciate your pointing to the prevalence of pro-natalist initiatives across the different dictatorships. In Nazi Germany, the Lebensborn program provided pregnant Aryan women with financial assistance. So it's evil, but it is consistent. In Fascist Italy, the Board for the Protection of Motherhood and Childhood did not make religious distinctions when providing reproductive health care. They made racial ones, running segregated obstetric clinics and nurseries in the East African colonies. But even there, the policy and action emphasized numbers above all. And it seems to contradict the spirit of the 1938 race laws. So I'm wondering, what do you think accounts for this difference between the letter of the law and its application?
Okay, great. Let's hear some answers and.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's try to be brief so we don't
Okay, you cut me off when you're ready. All right? Okay. All right, so I guess I'll go sort of in order. I mean, the question of agency and reviving anti-Semitism. I mean, I think what I would say is, when I look at the right in Eastern Europe, and that's really where I'm coming from in all of this, I see, movements and parties that are, I think consciously picking up a language that is now old and has a lot of tradition to it and applying it to a lot of new circumstances. And so you hear a lot of anti-cosmopolitanism, cultural Marxism, and now it's tied a lot to other things. It's tied to questions of gender ideology, as the gay agenda. And so there's this kind of way in which anti-Semitic language is getting kind of a new life applied now to new contexts and new people who are, endangered in these societies. At the same time that a country like Hungary is also saying, well, we're opposed to anti-Semitism, which is a way of covering up, our own sort of complicity in the Holocaust. And so there's this kind of double move there that I think is quite conscious and doesn't actually need, although there still is, there are Jewish Hungarians, of course, but it doesn't need a large Jewish community in the country to make that kind of rhetorical operation work. Omer's question about, can I imagine Hungary if the Nazis didn't come to power? I'm assuming the question would also assume that if the Great Depression had happened. So I think you would have had, you certainly would have had the 1920 law that discriminated against Jewish enrollment, so there would have been a mark of legal discrimination against Jews on the books, probably enforced more strongly, less strongly at different times, after the Depression more strongly. And I think you would have had a lot of what we might today call affirmative action programs to basically try to get as few Jews into certain kinds of places in society and more non-Jews there. So I think you would have had official/semi-official anti-Semitic policies. Maybe some violence on the streets at certain times. Probably that. Mark's question about fascism. You're quite right that I dodged it, and I knew I was dodging it as I was writing it. And the reason for that, though, is that, again, I'm coming at this really from someone who's thinking about Eastern Europe, and I find there's all these political formations, some of which are very clearly fascist, some of which are sort of fascist adjacent, some of which are fascist. And Mercedes brought this up really beautifully with her discussion of Spain this morning. And what seems to me the most important is the kind of policy implications and what these people do, rather than the labels that I'm interested in applying to them. So I am very committed to Mason's project of comparison. I'm ambivalent about the term or concept fascism to actually apply to what happened in some parts of Europe. I'm still, my mind is kind of open on that. And the letter of the law and the application, yes. I'm more interested, I think, in the sort of the conceptual thinking behind it. I'm not an Italian scholar, and I can't really tell you what it looks like when the rubber hits the road. There are lots of other things.
So I will address Omer, and I will also your question. As far as the emancipation, at least what I think that it happens, the integration of the Jews really, in a sense, bringing to light the difference of the Jews. They really thought that they could be integrated. I think that in the moment in which they passed the thresholds, that difference remained as such. Certainly as a sociological group. The Jews were prepared to integrate themselves, but they did not prepare to erase their difference. And that created a problem. In the same moment that they passed, there came out a difference that it was inherently structured as such. So I think that in attempting to solve the Jewish question, they create another question, that their presence within and the meaning of their presence within European society. Now, 100 years later, and the case of Algeria in this sense is teaching us, the Jews, they move, the differentiation that France did in Algeria, giving the citizenship to the Jews and not giving to the Muslim, is a kind of policy of divide et impera. But that is a colonial policy by definition, I would say. And then when the Jews in the 60s had to leave, they had to leave precisely because they were the buffers of the government. And it happens in Iraq, by the way. And not all the North Africa was yet the same situation, I would say. So is a question, the presence of the Jews. I do believe, even in those days in Israel, is a question. I do not think that is so, and I'm not addressing the things that you said. What is happening right now in Gaza is a serious matter, is a problem for the Jews, mostly outside Israel, because they feel themselves in a very awkward situation because they are not anymore accepted by the left as open mind, cosmopolitan, loving people, not persecuted. There is this aspect. And I would say something that I forgot to say before. Antisemitism changed with the creation of the State of Israel. We cannot address until two events changed the history of the Jews, the course of the history of the Jews, the Holocaust and the foundation of the state. This change, so the continuity, I would not address it, because these things that from one side we say is we have to have a transformation and a change, and then suddenly we fall into the trap in which we see a continuity between the diaspora and the state. I think that are two different places. That Israel wants to use the diaspora in order to get leverage is one matter. And that the fact that is happening not all over the place, because I believe that Atina, you, Annette, and all the others here are not on the same page with the State of Israel. And there is a difference that I believe they should be maintained, actually, because it's not the same. If there is an anti-Semitism, in what is happening now is the rapidity from October 7, in which the Jews from the, it's like the question of the occupation or the question of 48 or 67 suddenly appeared. There was a problem that was never addressed by any of the government. This government, differently for others, is going for all the money until the end. But there was also a problem. Now, the rapidity in which the Jews became unwanted, pariah, outcast, it didn't start 6 months after the war. It started immediately. So I'm asking it, not because I do not think that the war should be ended. I think that a war should be ended 1 year ago. I think that the hostages should be returned 1 year ago in saying, okay, let's play in another way. Let's think to another solution. But we cannot completely be blind and think that there is not a double standard on this. A double standard that doesn't help the Jews and anti-Semitism. As for your question, in 1938, and this is an important matter, there are 2 laws that came out in Italy, one in 1938 and one in 1943 in Verona, during the Repubblica Sociale of Salò. Now, in the colony, and this is the difference between fascist eugenics, but not even fascist eugenics. In 1924 it started. They didn't kill the people that were disabled, and they really promote a kind of eugenics that was correctional, educational, as far as for Italy, for example. So again, there are differences that I think that they should be maintained, even that. And the laws comes after 16 years, not after 1 month. And this make it a change. They didn't promulgate the law immediately against the Jews. Thank you. Sorry.
Poor Ofer. I think poor Ofer would love to say something also. I just want to observe that, the moment we start talking specifically about anti-Semitism, which we haven't done so far until this panel, is the moment that we sort of catapult ourselves into the present, which is kind of in a way that we haven't in our other panels, which is just worth noting. And I think that is really the point, back to Eric's question about, the geopolitical moment, that this geopolitical moment that we are in is charged in a very particular way. And that makes it, very difficult to have a conversation that we need to have, which is why I just would, since we don't have time to answer, the more I'm thinking about it, I actually, would want to push even further on my suggestion of scene number 4, because it does seem to me, obviously because it's also the period that I work on the most or have worked on the most, but that post-1945, post-knowledge of the Holocaust, in the ways that it was known, but it was certainly known, and certainly known by the survivors and by the Jewish displaced persons, and that where the fascists, the Nazis, had been defeated, where Jews were under the protection of the Western allies, and there is this real explosion of anti-Semitism right after the war, and not just in Eastern Europe, but also in, certainly in occupied Germany. And that, it seems to me, maybe that's a really kind of interesting place to look for, what is a kind of traditional anti-Semitism, by which we mean maybe the 19th century, what is, sort of really shaped by Nazism and fascism, and then something else where the knowledge is already there, the state of Israel is already about to be formed, Zionism is already a very strong force. In fact, and Jews are seen in all of those ways, as a sexual threat, as a financial threat, as a threat to property, and I just think that might be it might be worth inserting that into this conversation, and it might actually help us. And yeah, I won't say things about the situation today, except that yes, it is being used that way. Oh, and yeah, one thing about the definition, right? I mean, that is this problem, right? That we're talking about anti-Semitism, and yet we now have this codified definition, the IRA definition, with which so many people agree is completely inadequate. And then we have even, we have very, sort of complex and reasoned arguments by people, by David Engel, for example, about why we shouldn't be using the term anti-Semitism at all, and certainly not in declarations and definitions. So that all plays into this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have time for another round, but please be quick. Comments are okay, but quick comments, please. And then we have two, Austin and I forgot your name. Right. Yes.
I have a question. What do you do with Judeo-Bolsheviks when Bolsheviks kill Jews? So, I mean, from 1944 on till the death of Stalin. And it's a very important historical question. And I think we should try to work on it. But we need also Soviet specialists, nobody is there. But I think it's a very important question, and it will lead till now. How you have anti-Semitism without Jews, and how you have no discussion about fascist Islamism with a lot of Islamists. We are now in the 10th anniversary of the bombing in Paris, and they are fascist terrorist attacks. They are nothing else than that. And why it doesn't work in the geopolitical moment? Why the 7th of October attack, which is the biggest attack in the country in all the story, because Israel is a very small country. Compared to 9/11, it's much bigger. Why this has absolutely no effect on our geopolitical moment? I'm asking, it's a question of geopolitics, but it's also a question of history. When something happens, it's important. And when something happens, also, it's not important. And as historians, we should be thinking about that.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. I was struck by the focus on Judeo-Bolshevism, which of course makes sense, Paul, given the book that you've written and your expertise. But I was wondering whether it might be productive to expand our analyses of Judeo-Bolshevism to include like prior forms of modern anti-Semitism. So I'm thinking of what we might call the myth of Judeo-capitalism that we still see today, like in Rothschild and Jewish space blazers, but again, which predates Judeo-Bolshevism. And then Judeo-liberalism, which I think has its origins in the Italian Risorgimento. And all of which are based on this idea of Jews as agents of a corrupt modernity, and they're agents of a material, selfish world. And yet again, these predate Judeo-Bolshevism, and I think work to build like a global far-right and fascist movement in the war period and today.
Yeah, I have a question for Paul. In your introduction, you mentioned something that caught my attention, which was the Orban administration's use of sort of support for the Israeli right and its opposition to anti-Semitism. But at the same time, out of the other corner of its mouth, speaking about figures like George Soros, in a way that's very familiar with anti-Semitic tropes. And I wondered if you might be able to expand, or anyone on the panel might be able to expand upon the sort of ideological use of anti-Semitism among Europeans, especially Eastern European far-right figures.
We have one more.
Yes, so I wanted to say something about a very beautiful Paul's paper. And Manuela highlighted that until 37, 38, fascism was not anti-Semitic, and you have to reflect on that. Mussolini did a lot of declarations. The Jews will be okay in Italy, etc. And the point is, in 1968, they have to invent a tradition, because this, you have to justify why just now, the regime is anti-Semitic. And I think there's a false continuity between Ethiopia and the Russian laws, and there's a false continuity between demographic policy or eugenic, because as said Manuela, the eugenism Italian one is very different from the German tradition. So I think it's important to understand that. The other point I wanted to underline, now in France, we have Montée of anti-Semitism, and there is a reality. I see in my university, the students are very often afraid. We have sondage, how do you say sondage? Polls that show that in the opinion there is a real anti-Semitism, and in my university it's not only Free Palestine, but it is Moro-Juif. Moro-Juif, I'm sorry, it's anti-Semitism, and so we have to reflect on that, and there is a reality, which is that an important part of this anti-Semitism is inside the Arabo-Musulman population. We know that. So we are intellectuals. We have to reflect on that, not to ignore that because of Islamophobia. I'm sorry, but it's a reality too.
Okay, thank you. We have time for response.
All right, well, I'll make, I guess, 2 points perhaps in response to some of these questions, which I might group together. First, Anne-Marie, thank you, obviously, for the, words of the specialist. The timing is clearly very tricky to think about if you're trying to make a comparative argument about anti-Semitism across Europe, and so I accept that. I think what struck me is maybe a way of sort of coming back from the empirical and thinking it a little bit more conceptually, and to pick up one of Atina's points, which is the focus on Judeo-Bolshevism in the first section and sort of the racial marriage science type thing in the second section. And, for me, as I was thinking about this, Judeo-Bolshevism, is a kind of very 20th century version of a conspiracy theory that has many iterations over time, and it's a cultural code, to take Shulamit Volkov, and it's also a way of using the figure of the Jew to think about things. It's a way of thinking about disorder, about dystopia, and so forth. And so it has this kind of genealogy that even if it's not, it takes different forms over time and can be compared to other things at different moments. It goes back, a very long time into the Middle Ages. It's a conspiracy theory with a very kind of rich genealogy. On the other hand, if you start to look at the sort of notions of anti-Semitism that are at work in marriage laws, then you start to talk about conceptions of race that come from the Enlightenment. And the sort of the Middle Ages part falls away. And then you're with sort of the way in which George Mosse is talking about it in his book. And I found it very interesting. I didn't read the whole transcript of the Stanford debate, but I did read the section on race. And Gavin, is his last name Langmuir or Langmeyer? Yeah, so he was there, and he said a few things, although he didn't clearly say as much as he could have said. He made some interventions, but they weren't major ones. But he's someone who had talked a lot about that sort of conspiratorial thinking, as a medievalist. But that doesn't really come into play when people are talking about sort of, race within marriage law. And so then then the question is, well, race does, in that sense, become prior, and you have to then find a way to sort of fit anti-Semitism into that, rather than saying anti-Semitism has its own genealogy. So, to me, it's an example of how the two, intersect in different ways. The last thing I'll just say is about Hungary and anti-Semitism. What is really very striking today is that Hungary has really taken a lot of effort to sort of build allies within certain segments of the Jewish world. Chabad has huge footprint in Hungary today, and if you go to Budapest today, you're very struck by sort of visibly Orthodox Jews who've come as tourists to sort of walk around and see Budapest, and on the one hand, fine, but on the other hand, what is clearly going on there is that it's a way of, Hungary using this kind of philo-Semitism to push back against kind of European conceptions of what, proper European memory should be and how we should, remember the Holocaust, and saying, we have no problem here. Look, we have no problem here. So all of you guys in Brussels with your, gender and everything, just be quiet and leave us alone. And I think it's a conscious strategy. It very, very much is a conscious strategy. And you see it in other Eastern European countries too, but I know Hungary the best. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, I think we can go and have. Oh, we do have one more. Yeah.
You see the same thing in Austria, but it's even stronger because you have the election of Bruno Kreisky, who is Jewish, he's in exile. Looks like the country is doing well. But in fact, he bought into the myth of Austrian neutrality as Austria is Hitler's first victim. And by buying into that myth, he drew the Nazi to him. And he then appointed four Nazis, former SS Nazis, into the government.
Yeah, and I think that actually makes a very kind of interesting longer history of it. And to go to your point, it's an alibi that only is possible once you have a state of Israel.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have real anti-Semitism, and we also have real philo-Semitism. That's I think nobody denies that. That's not a controversial. Yeah.
No, but
Anyway.
being best friends with
Yeah.
and not only now with Paul, they will let him in.
All right.
Into the coffee break.